Wisconsin. That name is ringing around the world. Means that people are incredulous, shocked, stunned by the shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. We just can't explain it. We feel for him and his family and for all those who have suffered because of racism. But where do we begin to get our heads around this, if we can? Fortunately, I listened yesterday to some words from Doc Rivers. Doc is the coach of the LA Clippers basketball team in the United States. And he gave a brief, remarkably insightful and powerful speech yesterday about the whole Wisconsin situation. And I can't do it justice, but there are some elements in the speech that I need to pick up. And he was expressing with great passion his heartache about not only what happened to Jacob Blake, but what is happening to people of colour in the United States now and in centuries past. And it came from a place of love. There's no doubt, as you listen to the words of Doc Rivers, that he's a man of love. He loves his country, he loves his family, he loves his players. And it's because he is a person of love that when he reflects upon the tragedy of Wisconsin, he is expressing a broken heart. And at the same time, it's a cry, not simply for justice, although that is part of it, but it's a cry for a renewal of commitment of all people to practices of freedom. I want to explore some of the themes that Dr. Rivers mentioned, the experience of being brokenhearted, the power of love, and a call to practices of freedom. And in order to do that, I want to go back to an ancient story, which I'm going to commend to you as basically a story of love that calls us to take up practices of freedom. It's the story of Moses in the book of Exodus in the Hebrew scriptures. Now, from the start, let me be perfectly clear. This is not an historical account. This is one of those stories that's evolved within a certain community to capture the best and most powerful of their aspirations. That's how we use stories. You and I, as individuals, have stories. They tell us something about who we are and what we value. If we meet someone new or meet a new group and there's trust and mutual respect, typically we share our story or we hear the story of the other person. Stories are a way of capturing our experience and our values. So the story of Moses is a very powerful story of love and of freedom. In particular, in chapters 3 and 4, we have some classic images. The first is one of Moses who had been looking after a flock who encounters the burning bush. This is a theophany, an encounter with the divine. And in that encounter with the divine, Moses learns something about the very character of God. In being called to be a prophet, Moses is also given a gift of insight into the very heart of God. God is becoming engaged with Moses. God is becoming engaged with the Hebrew slaves because this God is a loving God. God has seen the sufferings of God's people. God has heard their cries. So God becomes engaged. And in that process of engagement, he recruits Moses to become a prophetic leader. It's an extraordinary It's a wonderful story, wonderful story. And it has great elements of humanity as Moses, who's been given this task, this big job, but feels so human, feels so vulnerable, but he can't let go. He's had this encounter, this divine experience. He's been given a glimpse into the heart of God. So despite his own misgivings and doubts, he becomes a leader, a prophetic leader who leads the people out of slavery. It's a gem. The story is an absolute gem. It's worth going back to and looking at closely. And it's a very significant story in the Christian scriptures. This story and the figure of Moses is used frequently and in critical places to interpret the significance of Jesus. A classic example of that is in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is the new Moses. The inference here is that part of the ministry of Jesus is Jesus' own engagement with the heart of God and the call of Jesus to institute practices of freedom. The Exodus motif, this motif of liberation, lies very much at the heart of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and you can't understand, you don't really get the ministry of Jesus until you see the significance of this Exodus motif, this motif of liberation, which brings us back to the 21st century. In a moment, I want to focus again on the events in Wisconsin, but I want to put it in a global context. For a start, as an Australian, I need to name our own history of racism. We have a terrible legacy here under the mantra of black deaths in custody. I'm talking about some 430 black deaths in custody, which not only point to the heartache of many Indigenous families and communities, but point to decades of racism and social injustice. So here in Australia and throughout the world, we see examples not just of racism, but all sorts of groups, all sorts of people who, perhaps on the basis of race or gender or sexuality or disability, are marginalised. And that marginalisation is so insidious that it becomes part of people's thinking, of social processes, of the very language we use. And because these processes of marginalisation, these processes which permit and encourage persecution, are so embedded, they're very hard to change. From a Christian perspective, the starting point for addressing these problems has to be the story of love. We don't pretend that we have the answers, or that we are in a superior position, or that we are superior people. Instead, from a Christian perspective, we are founded by a story of love. That wonderful Dreamtime story of Moses is motivated and shaped by a God who cares. This is not God, the remote and distant despot. This is God who feels with us, who feels for us, who is intimately involved in human existence and hurts when we hurt. This is the God who encounters Moses in the burning bush and then commissions Moses to this ministry and practice of freedom. This is the same God who commissioned Jesus and his followers, men and women, to risk a life and limb for the sake of freedom and in the name of love. It lies at the heart of our tradition. So somehow, some way, the experience of what is taking place in Wisconsin is a very clear, loud, and insightful call to Christians and arguably to all people of faith to look at our founding stories of love and to recommit ourselves anew to the practice of freedom. I'm hoping in the next day or two that some of you will have an opportunity to look at the words, look at the speech of Doc Rivers. It's a great speech. And what makes it great is the clarity. It's the clarity of someone who really cares. Doc Rivers cares. He cares what happened to Jacob Blake and Jacob's family. He cares what's happening to people of colour in the United States. He cares because he's a person of love. And because he's a person of love, he is brokenhearted by what has taken place. It's a man with a broken heart who, out of that love, out of that deep sense of engagement, out of his passion, calls us to love, calls us to justice, calls us to engage in practices of freedom. I'm not for a start saying that these issues, which have manifested themselves at all sorts of levels in our societies, in our communities, and in our churches, there's no easy fix. But the starting point's love. If we're not moved, if we're not stirred by what has happened, there's something wrong. In fact, on the contrary, most of us are moved, and that movement is a movement of the Spirit, and that Spirit is a spirit of love, and that spirit of love is calling us again to recommit ourselves as individuals and as faith communities to practices of justice and practices of freedom. What has happened is just unfathomable. But thanks to the like of Doc Rivers, we've been reminded of the importance of love. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, and Source of love. Amen.